He is a Latin professor at Our Lady of Guadalupe Seminary, and I will not embarrass him whether or not he was my Latin professor. But he's a very good friend and one of the better priests that we have in the fraternity, so I'm very glad to welcome him here with us today.
Well, I come from the over the rainbow section of Nebraska, which is where we have our seminary. And I suppose I should tell you a little bit about myself so that you can place what I have to say this morning. Otherwise, you just have somebody walk in black tell you a lot of stuff and you wonder, where is this all coming from? I am old enough, just barely, but old enough, to remember the church before the Second Vatican Council. And then I was swept along, as so many people were, in the changes which eventuated from the council. And I joined, at the end of the 1960s, a very large religious community, which was not disposed towards tradition at all. And I lived in that community for some years, and I taught in Portland, Maine for about 20 or 23 years. And then the school was experiencing some financial difficulties, and they said, we've got to have you begin to teach French as well as Latin and Greek. So I said, well, I haven't done French in about a dozen years. I'd need to retool. And they said, well, we'll send you to the Alliance Française in Paris during the summer. You can take a summer course and get yourself tooled up. So I went over to Paris and lived in our house on the left bank, quite near Notre Dame, and went to the Alliance Française with my card and all of my information. And they said, oh, didn't you get our note? That course has been canceled. But they said, we have another one starting in 6 weeks. I said, in 6 weeks, I have to be back in Portland, Maine teaching. So I bought myself a grammar book, and I would study in the mornings, and then in the afternoon, I would take a walk, because you couldn't really go anywhere in Paris except by foot in those days, because the exchange rate was killing. So I would usually take my bread and cheese, because at the house they were having tripe soup. If you've ever had tripe soup, you will know why I would buy bread and cheese. And I would eat that in front of Notre Dame, and then I'd just go in a different direction. One day I went down a little narrow side street. And whenever I passed a church, I would always go in and make a visit. And when I came out of the side street, there was a little square there, and on my left there was a church. So I went in to make a visit, and there was no table altar in the sanctuary. But of course that doesn't signify in Paris, if you've ever been to Paris, because so few people go to Mass in Paris, at least the new Mass, that it's mostly said in little side chapels where a priest and a chazalb and about a dozen people gather on Sunday and celebrate Mass. But then a bell rang, and a priest came out with a server, and he went into the sanctuary, went up to the high altar, and he started the Mass. And at one and the same moment, this was virtually instantaneous, I knew that this was the old Mass, which I hadn't seen since I was about 11 or 12 years old, that this was probably one of those churches that belonged to this group of people that there was something wrong with. So you have to understand, I didn't know anything about the traditional Mass at the time. I had been protected by it. The only thing I knew was my mother said to me, we lived in Norwalk, Connecticut then, and my mother said to me one day, she said, these people who had been in the choir for years and years and years aren't coming to choir anymore. I said, oh no. And she said, no, they go up to Mass in Ridgefield now, to some church where everything's still in Latin and the ladies wear veils. I said, wow, that's really weird. That's about, I don't think I even really knew who Archbishop Lefebvre was at the time. I was extremely ignorant and very naive. But I knew that there was something about these people that I had read or heard that put them in an irregular situation in the church. And therefore, I couldn't receive communion. But I stayed for the rest of the Mass. And then I left, and I thought two things. I thought, first of all, I thought my life is going to be different after this. Now, I don't know what that meant at the time. I don't know what it could have meant to me, but I just had this feeling, this overwhelming feeling that things were going to be different for me. Now, this was 1989. This was just after the Episcopal consecrations by Archbishop Lefebvre. And the other thing was that I couldn't go back to that church again because there was something wrong with these people. They were not canonically in the right situation and so on and so forth. However, as it happens, I went back there every day that I was in Paris after that. I could no longer have, or no more easily have made my feet walk in an opposite direction than fly to the moon. It was just one of those things. And I kept wondering, why is this happening to me? Why have I been brought to Paris not to take the course that the Alliance Française, but to find my way to this church, which was, of course, Saint Nicolas de Chardonnay, which is the largest fraternity of St. Pius X Church in Paris. On Sundays, if you've never been there, the scene is almost indescribable. The church is fairly sizable, but it's packed, literally to the walls, with mothers with babies and strollers in the side chapels, and people in all the chairs, because of course they don't have pews in the old French churches, they just have chairs with kneelers on them. And people in the aisles, people standing in the back of the church. And then if you go outside into the square is filled with people too, who are listening to the Mass over the loudspeakers which come from the front of the church. Now, you can go to almost any other church in Paris, except maybe Notre Dame, because that's where all the tourists go, and you will see that there's almost nobody there. But at this church, there are hundreds, possibly thousands of people every single week. Now, you may or may not know that the churches in France don't belong to the church. They belong to the government because of the Napoleonic Code and all kinds of laws and rules that were made in the wake of the Revolution. So the society literally took over Saint Nicolas. They sort of marched in and took possession of the church with the approval of the local pastor, who was a traditionalist pastor, and they kind of just took it. So the Archbishop of Paris, who was very disturbed by all this goings on, went to the president of France at the time. I don't remember which one it was. And he said, he explained to him, you're going to have to do something. You've got to get rid of these people. They're squatters. They don't belong to this church. You know, they're doing things without my authority, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the president was listening and listening and listening and kept looking at his watch, and he said, I'm sorry, Your Eminence, but I'm going to have to leave. I have to pick up my wife. She's at Mass at Saint Nicolas. At that point, the cardinal more or less gave up. So then I came back to the United States, and I thought, well, that was that, I guess. I don't know what it's supposed to mean. Until just about a year later, in the fall of 1990, I was chaplain for a little group of contemplative nuns called the Sisters Adorers of the Precious Blood, who have a monastery in Portland. And there was a very elderly man named Mr. Concannon, whose son was a priest in the diocese, and he used to stop after Mass sometimes and chat to me outside the monastery. And one morning he was waiting for me, he handed me an envelope. And he said, well, I guess I'm going to have to die without the old Mass. And I looked at the envelope, and inside there was a letter, about a 3 or 4 line letter from the bishop saying, we aren't going to have the Latin Mass, we don't want to have the Latin Mass, we don't want to do anything about the Latin Mass, thank you for writing. So, and Mr. Concannon was about 90 at the time. So I took the letter home, and I took a Post-it, and I wrote on it, I'm sure you'll do whatever you can for Mr. Concannon. And I put it in an envelope and I sent it to the bishop, whose chancery was right down the street from our school. Well, then I forgot about it because the months rolled by. And the following spring, so now we're in 1991, I got a 2-page single-spaced letter from the Chancery, and I knew it was something different because it didn't have my address just stuck on it on a sticker. It was an actual letter. And it went on and on and on about, again, why they didn't have the Latin Mass and why they wouldn't have the Latin Mass and why it wasn't a good idea to have the Latin Mass. And I thought, why are they telling me this? Because I'd forgotten about having sent the letter with the note on it. And then finally, in the last couple of paragraphs, if you're reading letters from bishops, you always have to get to the last couple of paragraphs. That's where the meat is. And it said, the bishop is wondering, because this was from the chancellor of the diocese, the bishop is wondering whether you would be willing to do something on an ad hoc basis for these people. And I thought, there's the connection. That's why I went to Paris. That's why I ended up in front of Saint Nicolas de Chardonnay without realizing I was there. That's why all of this has happened. So I wrote back and I said, I'll do anything the bishop wants. I said, but I don't know how to say the Latin Mass, so I'm going to have to learn. So I went down to Boston to see my old spiritual director from the novitiate, and he taught me over a weekend to say the Mass. And on September 16th, 1991, we started the Mass in Portland, Maine. It was one Sunday a month at that point. And then gradually we got a second Sunday, and then I said to the bishop, you know, it would be nice if we could have it the first and third and fourth Sunday of the month, or even the first and second and third, because then people wouldn't have to wonder, is there going to be a Mass this Sunday or is there not going to be a Mass? I said, it's sort of difficult for people. And he looked at me and he said, well, I don't know. And I said, you know, and then there are the months that have an extra Sunday in them at the end. And he said, you want this every week, don't you? I said, well, ideally, yeah. And he said, okay, you can have it every week. So that's what we did. And then gradually, I learned about the Fraternity of St. Peter through various circumstances and ultimately joined because I simply couldn't continue to say the new Mass. So that's how I came to the fraternity in 1998 or 99. I don't remember for sure which year it was. And then I got sent to the seminary, and that's where I've been in exile ever since. Teaching Latin to unwilling small boys. I pray that this is my purgatory. So anyway, I recently saw an interview on the internet. As you know, Father is very internet-oriented, and the Live Mass thing has been an extraordinarily fruitful apostolate for the Latin Mass in this country and really made a difference in many, many people's lives. We have seminarians who come now. They used to say things like, well, you know, I saw the Latin Mass because the chaplain of our college says it at the Newman Center or because our parish church. Now they say, I saw the Latin Mass on the internet. And as soon as I saw it, I thought, that's what I want. See, because it only takes an instant. Pope Pius XII said, I can never remember whether it's in the beatification allocution for St. Maria Goretti or in the canonization one, but anyway, he said, at baptism, the Holy Ghost plants a seed in us, which can grow and be nourished into a strong plant, or can wither and be neglected and not really grow at all. I think that's what God does with young people nowadays. You know, I often say to the seminarians, how did you get here to Nebraska? And one of them says, well, I flew, you know, or I drove. I said, I don't mean that. I mean, what are you doing here? You were born in, you know, 1981 or something like that. You didn't grow up with the old Mass. I said, God is picking you up and putting you here. Because you didn't have any antecedents. You didn't have any of the memories that I had as a child of the Mass. You didn't know as soon as you saw it again, this is it. This is the Mass. This is the way things are supposed to be. So anyway, I was watching this interview on YouTube. It was done by the BBC in preparation for the Holy Father's visit to England, so it was a couple of years old. It was really something. Now this is funded, of course, by taxpayer money in England, because the BBC is funded by people's money. So it was filled with the most media-driven views of the Pope. They talked about the sex scandal, the Regensburg speech against the Mohammedans, the furor caused by the lifting of the excommunication of the 4 bishops consecrated by Monsignor Lefebvre. Of course, the 4 bishops need not even exist. They want to talk about Bishop Williamson, you know? But in the first quarter of the program, they had an interview with the Pope's brother, Monsignor George Ratzinger, who's about 3 years older than the Holy Father. And evidently, they didn't get what they wanted from him. It was a very short little segment of what must have been a much lengthier interview. But the one question that they had on the program, they asked him some question, I don't remember, it was a general question about the Holy Father, and he said, well, the Holy Father sees the liturgy as a central pillar on which the church rests. And I thought, now this is going to be interesting, how they follow up on this and how they unpack it. But in fact, they just let it go, and they went on to Hans Kung or somebody like that. I think that the interviewer made a big mistake in not following that up. But it was an understandable mistake, I suppose, in a way, because the interviewer didn't really understand that the liturgy was important. They didn't have any views in this hour-long program of the Mass. It was mostly a political program, because most people see the church nowadays as one more political entity, amongst others. That's why the president and so forth want to privatize religion. They want to make it something which isn't in the public sector, because it's basically something which is private. You know, they talk about freedom of worship, which is not what the Founding Fathers talk about. They talk about freedom of religion. It's a different thing altogether. Anyway, this little statement of Monsignor George Ratzinger about the Holy Father saying that the liturgy is the central pillar on which the church is founded needs, I think, to be more fully understood and unpacked. And that's what I want to try to do this morning a little bit. In today's world, it's difficult to extricate ourselves from the TV's talking heads, you know, CNN and Fox News and all the rest of it. A world of talking heads that gives shape to our perception of the world, and not merely on the television, but also on the internet, through the newspapers and the magazines and the radio. The people interviewed on this program that I'm mentioning included also Hans Kung, John Allen from the National Catholic Reporter, and Timothy Radcliffe, who we used to call Timothy Radical. He was the former Master General of the Dominicans. And this was presented as a balanced program, you know, so that, but really what they wanted to do is, I'm sure they wanted to confirm the position of the people watching the program on their take on the Pope. They wanted to place him, they wanted to put him in a little box and say, this is a really conservative guy who has very old-fashioned views, and now we understand where he's coming from and why he is the way he is and blah, blah, blah. And then they could sort of shuttle him aside and make the visit less important. Now this, of course, was on TV before the Pope came to Britain. When the Pope came to Britain, he surprised everybody. They said he'd have very small numbers and he had huge crowds. They'd say his talks would not be well received, and they were very well received. They said that there would be no consequences to his visit, and even the English bishops, I mean, if you think the bishops in this country are bad, go to England. Even the English bishops began to do things like saying, we should have meatless Fridays again. Now, they didn't necessarily do it for all the right reasons. The Archbishop of Westminster said, because we want to gain Catholic identity. Well, that's not why we make sacrifices. We make sacrifices in order to offer to Christ some measure of his sufferings. But it doesn't matter if they do it for the wrong reasons. They're doing it. They're doing a good thing. And given their own formation and the way they live, you can't expect, 100%. 70% is fine, as long as you get something good. But I don't really want to talk about the program that I saw. Just that one little statement from Monsignor George Ratzinger about his brother. If indeed the liturgy of the Catholic Church is one of the chief pillars on which the church rests, then I think we should pay close attention to that. We especially should pay close attention to that. Nowadays, traditional Catholics find themselves in a rather tempting position. The careful and somewhat grudging acceptance accorded Ecclesia Afflicta, which, think about it, is almost a quarter of a century ago now, has given way to the astounding news in Universi Ecclesiae of 2007 that the old liturgy was never abolished by the Church. Astounding news to those of us who worshipped in ways, in high school auditoriums and hotel rooms and so on and so forth for years, or in cemetery mausoleums. I'm sure some of you are accustomed to taking your children to places like that for Mass, when the old liturgy was considered such a pariah that we couldn't have it in real churches because, well, I suppose because people might see it and get attracted to it. So we find ourselves now in a position where we're told that this liturgy was never abolished by the Church, though this might have come as a surprise to Paul VI, who definitely intended it to be abolished. And the bishops have seen the future of the traditional liturgy taken out of their hands, at least technically, and returned to the priests and their people. Hundreds of priests have wearily but doggedly set out for the plains of Nebraska to learn the old liturgy. They have included ordinary parish priests, chancellors of dioceses, vicars general of bishops, and even the occasional bishop himself. In the light of such occurrences, we might be excused for thinking that we can relax a little, let down our guard just a bit, make friends with the representatives of that church, which we have, let's face it, turned our backs on quite a while ago. Or rather, a church which seemed to have turned its back on us. There is also the phenomenon of fixing the new Mass, most notably in the new translation which gave rise to the quite extraordinary furor which surrounded its introduction into English-speaking Catholic lives just last Advent. We watched, from a safe distance, the fearful warnings against so much change all of a sudden in people's ways of worshiping, and we thought, they're just changing the translation. What do you mean? Do you remember 1964? Hello? And I even saw one letter in a newspaper which brought a smile to my lips. The lady suggested that it might be possible to have maybe one Mass a week in the old, familiar translation. And I thought to myself, yeah, once a week, in a mausoleum or hospital chapel in months that don't have R's in them. Welcome to my world. Some bishops and priests even formed organizations to protest the new translation. And some priests even went so far as to resign their posts, unable to make themselves use it. For those of us with long memories, which include such names as Father Gomer de Pau from the 1960s, this made for a regurgitation of memories which quickly wiped that smile of self-satisfaction off our lips, because we remember what it was like. And whatever may be the problems with the new Mass, and the Holy Father obviously thinks that there are, we don't want people to go through what we went through in the 1960s. Nobody who went through that could possibly wish that on another person, especially with regard to Holy Mass. But I'm not here to talk about the changes in the new Mass either. I just want to suggest at the very beginning that the war is ongoing. That we can't relax now because we've got Universi Ecclesiae. We can't say, okay, it's just a matter of time now. It's not a matter of time. It's a matter of gaining ground, regaining ground, inch by inch. And it is not going to be difficult, because now we're faced with generations of clergy who have been brought up with the new Mass. They haven't been trained in the traditional way. They haven't studied St. Thomas. They haven't studied the liturgy. One young priest who came out to Nebraska for training came in a week when I was busy with other things and I didn't have as much involvement in the priest training as I normally do. Normally I'm in charge of it, but this particular week I could only come in the middle. And I was giving a talk on the Mass, and he interrupted me. He said, "I am so angry at this moment." And I quickly thought, oh gosh, what did I say? You know, what have I said now? And I said, well, Father, taking my head in my hands, tell us why you're angry. And he said, I am angry because I was lied to. The sister who taught us liturgy lied to us about the old Mass, lied to us about what it contains and what it's about and how rich it is. And I said, well, Father, you've had an experience which many of us have had one way or the other. I said, but you don't want it to lead you into negativity, because negativity is always a dead end. What you want to do is you want to harness those feelings of anger. When you get back to Brooklyn, you want to tell the people the truth about the Mass. You want to give them the richness of the Church's tradition. You want to take whatever you've learned here and hand it on. That's what we have to do, because if we become too mired in negativity, oh, look what this bishop is doing, look what this, I mean, you know, we all know that the Church is suffering from all kinds of messy and most inappropriate situations. But wringing our hands is not going to make things better. It's really easy to tear something down, but to build it up again takes a long time and takes every single person doing whatever he or she can, no matter how small that may be. You never know when you say to another person, yeah, I go to the Latin Mass and it's this kind of thing. You never know. The reaction that you get is just a reaction. It doesn't matter. At night, when the person turns off the lights and is lying in bed and thinking, that's what matters. So it's never a bad idea. As it says in the Bible, I'm not a real Bible person. I was a pre-conciliar Catholic when we read Bible stories, but we didn't really read the Bible. So I never know exactly where everything is coming from. But either St. Peter or St. Paul says in one of his epistles, be ready to give a defense of that which has been passed on to you. That's very important. Each one of us has a responsibility when it comes to that. We can't just lie back and let the beauty of the Latin Mass wash over us. If God has given you and me an appreciation for it, He's given it not just so that we can cling to it and enjoy it and revel in it, but so that we can pass it on. So in this era of cultural relativism, now that's an easy phrase to say, cultural relativism. What are we talking about? We're talking about what they said in this program that I saw, where the guy said, in these or similar words, he said, you know, the Pope actually still believes in absolute truth, which comes from God himself. And he said, to believe that in a world where truth is really my opinion or your opinion doesn't make sense to a lot of people. That's the world we live in now. That's how people think. They don't think on the basis of principles anymore. They don't follow logically from the principles to the things which build up from the principles. They're not taught that way anymore. They're taught, how do you feel about, I don't know what, a Eucharistic procession, or how do you feel about Stations of the Cross, You say, well, I think it's a good idea, but it's all relative nowadays. And that makes a very different world. I would even suggest that this is the last, I hope, the last attack on the church. The church which was attacked, by Arianism, by the Babylonian captivity, by Protestantism, by the French and Russian revolutions, and now is being just as fully attacked by cultural relativism. There is no absolute anymore. Well, if there isn't, then the liturgy is just something that we invent. You can get the liturgy committee together and they can say, well, this Sunday, with Thanksgiving coming up, we thought that the chapel should be decorated with gourds and stuff. And we should have the children bring up, wheat and all that stuff. That's the kind of thing which goes on in the Novus Ordo churches. And in an era of ecumenical encounters, even though they are increasingly unsuccessful, they still continue. And in a world where the specter of a priesthood in an ongoing crisis, in a world such as that, the Holy Mass as a pillar, an unchanging pillar in the church, becomes ever more important, while everything swirls around it. We need to take time, first of all, to remember the stakes, to remember what soon the so-called Vatican II generation will pass into history. Benedict XVI will undoubtedly be the last pope of Vatican II to reign over the church. And in a church that has included John the 23rd, Paul the 6th, John Paul the 1st, John Paul the 2nd, and the present incumbent, long may he reign, that will make an enormous change. We need to remember that. We need to remember that there will soon be an increasing number of Roman Catholics who, if they are still part of the 18 or so % of people who assist at Mass regularly in this country, will no longer remember a time when there was no Mass facing the people. Will no longer remember a time when there were no altar girls, when there was no communion in the hand, when there were no permanent deacons giving the sermon on Sunday, when there was no priestless Sundays, when there were no priests not wearing the prescribed vestments, no churches where finding the tabernacle became a game of hide and seek. This is going to be the church that they grew up with. And they're going to think that it represents what the Catholic faith is. That's a problem. We need to read. We need to study. We need to work. And to remember to take nothing for granted. To remember when going to Sunday Mass meant, as I was saying, to remember if there would be a Sunday Mass on this particular Sunday. Was it an even or odd week? To remember taking children out to a hospital chapel or a cemetery mausoleum or a hotel ballroom for Sunday Mass. To remember enduring the quizzical looks and even the hostility of well-meaning relatives who could not understand what on earth had happened to us. To remember when homeschooling meant something that was done in the days of Abraham Lincoln. I tell the young men at our seminary, take nothing for granted. Do not think that you can roll out of bed in the morning into our beautiful chapel, constructed on the sacrifices of people who are sitting here today, so that nothing would be denied God in the house where future priests would be educated. Do not think you can roll out of bed in the morning, I tell them, and comfortably lull yourself into the beauty of the Gregorian chant and the divine office and the indescribable beauty of the Mass, be it solemn, sung, or low, as long as there is any place on earth where people are denied the right to worship as you do. Archbishop Lefebvre said it best, ours is a missionary Mass. It is a Mass which seeks to go outside itself and find people who are looking for it. They may not know what they were looking for, as I didn't know what I was looking for on that day in Paris when I wandered into the Lefebvre's church. But, you know, I'm here today because of that chance encounter. I say the same thing to you as you enter this church every Sunday, confident in the knowledge that no sacrifice but the sacrifice of the Mass as it was celebrated by the Curie of Ars, by the North American martyrs, and heard by St. Therese, by St. Bernadette, by St. Teresa Benedicta, and by nameless thousands, millions who have gone to God comforted and strengthened by its message will be offered here. What is that message of the Mass? In a word, or rather in a picture, I would suggest it this way. It's the difference between a modern church, which for all intents and purposes, I drove in from Tampa last night, so I got a chance to see some of the churches in the area, at least from the outside. And they look like gyms or banks. They don't look like churches. They look like they're trying to imitate other physical and architectural entities around them, to sort of blend in, sort of. But then think about Chartres Cathedral. Now, people come from all over the world to look at Chartres Cathedral, to wonder at it. Now, let's think about when Chartres Cathedral was constructed. Most people couldn't read and write. They didn't have a missal with Latin on the one side and their vernacular on the other. When they went to Mass, there was a rood screen between them and the altar. They could catch glimpses of the priest, but they couldn't even see what we can see at Mass nowadays. Where, to paraphrase the gospel, did they get all that? Where did Chartres Cathedral come? These are the people, we're told, didn't understand the Mass because it was in a foreign language. They didn't know what it was all about. We're told these were people who lived in ignorance, in superstition, and yet they were able to build Chartres Cathedral, which I would suggest is a little bit more fully architecturally aware of what's going to be happening in it than these churches that look like Key Bank. You know, there's a church up in Maine, Most Holy Trinity in Saco, Maine. They used to have a real church, but for some reason they knocked it down and they built another one. And we went in there for a funeral one weekday. And when you walked in, the chairs were in serried ranks, so that if you tried to kneel, you would be kneeling on the head of the person in front of you. The altar was on the floor, as at the lowest point of this whole room. In back of it, on slightly raised steps, was a whirlpool and a lemon tree. There were no statues, there were no stained glass windows. There were a couple of banners that said, you know, peace now and stuff like that. But that was the only decoration. And the president of our school, who was by no means a traditionalist, was looking around and he said, "Where's the Blessed Sacrament?" And the sister coordinator person said, "Oh, come with me." She took us outside the chapel, down the hall, take a left, take another left, and inside a room which was about the size of 3 telephone booths, there was a pole with a box on it and a little kneeler in front of it. You could get maybe 2 people into the room, and that's where they hid the Blessed Sacrament. Now that comes from a certain vision of what the Mass is. When you go to our church, the altar is always the highest point. It's always up on steps because it's the mountain of Calvary. You don't look down on Calvary, you look up. As it says in the Psalms, I look up to the mountain, whence cometh my help. So, therefore, we have to ask ourselves, what is the Mass? The Mass is a sacrifice. It is not a memorial. It is not a meal. And it is not a community gathering. The Mass is the sacrifice of the cross made present on the altar in an unbloody manner through the action of an ordained Roman Catholic priest. I didn't used to be so catechism-like about my definition of the Mass until I realized that decades had gone by, and I was doing a priest training in a southern diocese at a seminary one time in combination with Father Nolan, whom you all know, who was a deacon at that time. And I gave my usual introductory talk, and I said, you know, the Mass, a priest is ordained to offer sacrifice. If you don't have a sacrifice going on at the altar, you don't need a priest. That's why Protestants can have ministers or lay people, you know, who fulfill their functions, because they don't have a sacrificing priesthood. And then I had to leave right after my talk, and Father Nolan came to me afterwards. He said, you won't believe what happened after you left. Now, the priests there were mostly young priests, from about just ordained to about 7 or 8 years after ordination. He said, they all crowded around me. They said, where did Father Goodwin get that? He said, get what? And they said, that thing about the Mass, about the priest being ordained to offer sacrifice. He said, well, I mean, that's just kind of basic Catholic theology. I mean, they said, well, we never heard that. And we went through this seminary for 7 years. He said, well, what were you told a priest was ordained for? And they said things like, the priest is ordained to gather the people for worship. Or the priest is ordained to, I don't know, it was fluff. You know, then you wonder why there are so few priests, and why priests don't last in their vocations, and why priests fail their vocations. Because they aren't built on the rock of what it is that they're doing. They have some of them, God forbid that it should be true, but I don't know what else can mean. A Protestant-like idea of what goes on at Mass. This is a problem. This is a big problem. That essential definition having been made clear of the Mass, certain inescapable consequences follow. First of all, if the holy sacrifice of the Mass is the representation on the altar of the sacrifice of Calvary, then it is essentially the work of Christ. Therefore, the question of our participation, so dear to the Fathers of the last General Council of the Church, must be addressed. What about us? What about our place in the Mass? The work of the last council was predicated, especially as regards the general matters which touch upon the sacred liturgy, and in particular, the document on the sacred liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, which particularly addresses itself towards the liturgy. It was founded upon the work done by the so-called Liturgical Movement. Now, I don't know if you've all heard of the Liturgical Movement, or what it signifies, but it's basically an overall name for a group of priests who came from different backgrounds, and some of whom never knew one another, but they were interested in the liturgy. It started after the French Revolution in France, basically with the work of Dom Prosper Guéranger, whose books on the liturgy I hope you're familiar with or will become familiar with during your lives, because they're very, very rich and beautiful and very helpful to read. And they take you through the entire liturgical year. But very soon, two different directions started in this liturgical movement. There was the movement of Dom Guéranger on the one hand, and Father Nicolas Guire on the other hand, who lived from 1939 to 1924, as well as individuals with a more questionable point of view, such as Father Joseph Jungmann, Father Pius Parsch, and Father Adrian Fortescue. Now, what was the difference? The first group said the Mass is the most precious possession that the Church has, and we need to understand and appreciate it more. The others said there's something wrong with the Mass, and we've got to figure out what it is that's wrong with it, and then we're going to figure out a way to fix it. Now, it was obviously the second group who triumphed at the Second Vatican Council. But if you read through Sancro Concilium, you will find that there are paragraphs which seem internally contradictory. You know, one famous example is the paragraph on Latin in the liturgy, and it says, all things being equal. And you think, well, what things? And equal to what? But never mind. It says, all things being equal, Latin should be maintained as the language of liturgical prayer in the Church. That's good. Then it goes on to say, however, in countries where the National Conference of Bishops determines that it would be helpful to have some parts of the Mass in the vernacular, they can get permission for the vernacular parts of the Mass from the competent office at the Holy See. Nonetheless, if people in the conference feel that an even wider use of the vernacular is warranted, they can also get permission from the competent authority at the Holy See. So we go from, in one paragraph, from Latin being the language of the liturgy to, if you want the wholesale vernacular, you can get it from us. Well, which is it? It doesn't make sense. I would suggest that it was the two sides of the liturgical movement more or less warring against one another, which created this problem. I know fully, of course, that during the council, or at least towards the end of the council, some of the priests like Father Schillebeckx and Father Ronner and others made it clear, once they had triumphed, that they had written the documents of the council in such a way that they could be read with a traditional understanding by some of the council fathers, but it would leave loopholes later for the things which they planned to do. But I think when it comes to the liturgy, it was really founded in the liturgical movement and the two disparate parts of it that never really got back together. And that's why Sacrosanctum Concilium, I think, is a kind of two-headed document. The present Holy Father has been tireless in his insistence that faulty or seemingly faulty passages in the documents of the Council are to be understood according to tradition. Now, this is a biggie. This is very important, because the Holy Father is saying there are sections of the Council which are difficult to understand. This is something which we couldn't win. You know, you'd say to the bishop, yeah, but it says this on page 118, it says this on page 120. I don't get it. And we were founded on that. In our founding documents, in the protocol which we signed, which was the same one which was given to Archbishop Lefebvre, and which he signed but then later reneged on, it says there are things in the Second Vatican Council that we don't fully understand, and we cannot reconcile with tradition. But we promise to go through these things in a non-polemical manner, which is a reasonable enough thing to ask. But there are these things which cause us to wonder. I mean, if 50 years after the Council, the Holy Father is saying, now we're going to get to the authentic interpretation of Vatican II, is it just possible? I just ask the question, is it just possible that there may be things in Vatican II which are problematic if it takes 50 years and we're still looking for that elusive, proper interpretation? Nonetheless, the Holy Father's move and his constant insistence that we have to go back to tradition is very, very important. This simple formula is of immense importance to us as it gives a direction to the now half-century-old questions concerning important sections of the documents. And it says that we are to go back in time to the traditions of the Church to find long, elusive resolutions to these questions. Since our concern is the liturgy, I would suggest that we go back to the very beginning, to the actual sacrifice of Christ upon the cross, and to find there a picture of liturgical piety and of liturgical participation. The Council famously called for a participatio actuosa on the part of those assisting at Holy Mass. This has long been beaten into unwilling souls as active participation and is responsible for liturgical commentators, Eucharistic ministers, altar girls, ministers of welcome, and the other people who bother you when you try to go to church. If you go to the beginning, if you go to the sacrifice of Calvary, on Calvary, you'll find none of those. You find instead a small band of the faithful centered around our Blessed Lady and St. John the Apostle, who, according to the latter's memoirs, say nothing and do nothing. What does Our Lady do at the foot of the cross? We're not told. What did she say? Apparently nothing that needed to be recorded. Evidently, participatio actuosa, therefore, is not founded on doing things. It's not founded on saying things. It's not found in assuming roles. It would seem to be essentially connected to an interior participation. For no one could be so bold as to deny Our Blessed Lady a uniquely deep and full participation in the sacrifice of the cross, one which is unrepeatable by any other human being, ever. And yet she does and says nothing. She is instead, I would suggest, wholly receptive to the action of her Son, and it is this receptivity which is of the greatest importance for us to understand. What, if I may ask, is the moment of supremely unifying character for the faithful assisting at Holy Mass? It's the moment of sacramental communion. Let us examine it as it exists in the traditional form of Holy Mass and attempt to find in it that notion of receptivity. When in the traditional form of the Mass, the faithful receive Holy Communion, there is first of all that word, receive. Now in the Catholic Church, words make a big difference. Words matter. Protestants, and nowadays, unfortunately, even some Catholics speak of taking communion, because that's really what they do. They go up to the priest or the Eucharistic minister and they literally take communion. But it is not so in the traditional form. You can see the difference if you're old enough to think yourself back to your childhood, and that childhood took place as mine did in the context of the traditional Mass. When we were children, but before we received our own First Holy Communion, we watched at the Children's Mass on Sunday. Now, the Children's Mass on Sunday in the 1950s meant that the children sat up front and that the sermon was minimally geared to their intellectual capacities. That was it. So we'd be sitting up and we'd see the sisters go to communion first. And we'd see them unpin their veils when they came back. And the front of their veils would come down like a little cloister, a carry it with you cloister, so that they could make their thanksgiving. Children notice things. They may not understand everything fully, but remember what I said about St. Maria Goretti and what Venerable Pius XII said. You know, that there's a seed planted at baptism. It's already there. It's planted by God Himself. Therefore, it becomes fruitful under the action of sanctifying grace. So we'd see the sisters come and go, and then we would see our parents who were sitting behind us go to Holy Communion. And they would walk up with their hands folded, and they would kneel at the altar rail, a material separation that says very clearly, this far and no farther. The sanctuary is a space where God dwells. And then the priest going by them would take a pure white host out of the golden ciborium, and making the sign of the cross over each individual, he would whisper a prayer and place the sacred host on the person's tongue. You're very familiar with this rite. It goes on every day at Mass. But let us examine it. First of all, people who go up to the sanctuary with hands folded and eyes lowered. This is not the usual way that people behave. If you saw somebody walking like this, you know, on the street, you'd think, okay, religious weirdo sort of thing. But at Mass, it makes perfect sense. Why? Because those people are preparing externally for the great reception of the body and blood, soul and divinity of the second person of the Blessed Trinity into themselves. Bishop Bruskowitz, a couple of years ago, in the letter that goes out monthly to the priests of the diocese, had to put in a notice saying that the people should be instructed at Mass that they shouldn't come up to communion with dirty hands or with hands with phone numbers, or he said, or even with foul words written on them to receive Holy Communion. Now, if this is true in the Diocese of Lincoln, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then they kneel at the altar rail. That material separation between the majesty and holiness of God and our sinful creatureliness, which we are unable to overcome. Christ comes to us in the person of the priest, and he repairs that gap which separates us from him. He asks nothing of us, but blessing us with the sign of his cross before we receive him through the action of the priest, known traditionally and most aptly, of course, as the Alter Christus, the second Christ. The priest then places him on our tongue. Like Our Lady at that moment, we are interiorly wholly devoted to him. And like Our Lady, we do nothing, and we say nothing. But we do receive, and that action of receiving is the most powerful one that we can enter into. Literally, share in, participatio. Then the communicant returns to his seat and amidst the silence of the church makes his thanksgiving. Now, there are those who would say, well, this happened through accidents of history. These were merely things which people came to through other things that were going on at the time and other cultural events. To say that is to say that the Holy Ghost doesn't live in the church, that the Holy Ghost is not the chief former and guarantor of our liturgical prayer. It's to say that liturgical prayer is simply a human thing. But look at the Bible. In the Old Testament, when Moses was given the prescriptions for the Hebrew worship, he was told the size of the tabernacle, the material it was to be made of, how it was supposed to be located. He was given, measurements and how it was to be decorated. He was given all of these seemingly little details, how the priests were to be dressed, how often they were to be washed, what their clothes were to be made of. Every little thought was made specific. Because God didn't want to act like a monster. He didn't want to say, okay, I've got something here which says how it's proper to worship me. Now guess what it is? No, he told them. And in the Old Testament, when they are faithful to those things, they are blessed. The Hebrews were very, very trying to God. When they got to the Holy Land and they said, we want a king. We want a king. We want a king. All the people around us have kings. We don't have a king. And God said to them, you have the judges, you have the law, you have the prophets, you have everything that you need. Yeah, but we want to be like the people around us. We want a king. And God said, okay, you can have a king. And he gave them a king. And then they said, we want to marry the people around us, the Canaanite women and the Phoenician women, and so on and so forth. And God said, mixed marriage is not a good idea. Not good. And they said, yeah, but have you seen, our wives when they get to be in their 40s and 50s? Give us a break here. So God finally said, okay, you can marry these people. But When did he land on them? Whenever they were unfaithful to the liturgical prescriptions that he gave them, that's when his wrath exploded on them and they were taken off to Babylon and all these other things. So God is flexible to a degree, but not where it concerns his worship. Now the question is the God of the New Testament different from the God of the Old Testament? Has he changed? It doesn't matter to him how he's worshipped anymore? It's, whatever you feel like, whatever you think is clever, whatever you think is meaningful. Like the lady, the minister of music who came into me one Sunday and said, I'm changing all the hymns. I said, oh? And she said, yes, I need to do these other hymns. I've had a really bad week. I need to do this for me. I said, yeah, but the hymns are not really, it's not all about you. And she looked at me like, what planet did you come from? So therefore, the God of the New Testament is the same as the God of the Old Testament, but he communicates the elements of worship to us in a different way. He communicates it through the Holy Ghost, because I said, I'll send you another advocate who will teach you all truth. The Holy Ghost lives in the church, and the Holy Ghost, through the centuries, has given us the Mass. Where did our Mass come from? Who invented it? The Council of Trent says that in its essentials, it goes back to the apostles. That's as much of a guide as we have. It's not the Mass of St. Pius V. He just put together what already existed in a formal missal. It's not the Mass of St. Gregory I. He just collated what already existed. Now, the new Mass, I can give you a list of the names. That's no small difference. To sit around a table and say, I don't know, Ed, what do you think we should do about the offertory? Is different. There's a reason why we can't point to Pope so-and-so or to Saint so-and-so and say, this is where the Mass came from. It's because it doesn't matter who the human instrumentality is. It's the Holy Ghost who is in charge. The posture for communion. All of the bits and pieces that go into the reception of the Most Blessed Sacrament, surrounded as it is with carefully ruled movements and gestures on the part of priest and people, is a picture of the whole purpose, I would suggest, the whole nature, the whole meaning of Holy Mass. And whatever contradicts the significance of all this is quite simply wrong. We have to begin with principles. We have to begin with that which is unchanging and unchangeable. The Mass is the sacrifice of Calvary. I would even suggest to you that the wearing of all the proper vestments at Mass, including amice, maniple, and chasuble, the carrying of the Blessed Sacrament in other non-golden receptacles, or even as I've seen on TV at the National Shrine, on plates made out of some sort of stuff. The use of pita bread and other non-approved matter for the body of Christ, the placing of the sacred host into the hands of the recipient, the use of lay people to distribute the Holy Sacrament is, in part, responsible for so many priests losing their sense of their vocation in the ways that we've seen in the newspapers almost every day for the last few years. Where did this all come from? It comes from priests losing their way. The priest's intimate relationship with Christ is lived out most particularly at Holy Mass. If that priest is celebrating Mass in a kind of do-it-yourself, cut along the dotted line and add water fashion, then he's going to have one sort of sense of his priesthood. If a priest says our Mass, is going to have a different sense. In our Mass, I can't say, today I feel like putting my arms out like that. I want to embrace everybody. It's a nice thought. But in the Mass, everything that I do, everything that I say is prescribed. This is a great freedom. When I came to the traditional Mass, I felt, first of all, an enormous sense of the fittingness of each gesture and movement of the Mass going to each and every other gesture of the Mass. And when I celebrated the new Mass, it was like there were gaps and dichotomies. This is something which priests do every day, and it either wears them down or it builds them up. Yes, they used to tell us, all these things, these externals, can change. But ought they to? Have the changes led to the results that were promised by Paul VI himself in the Bull Missale Romanum, which we were given, apparently incorrectly to understand, replaced the Old Mass? Now that's a very interesting document to read, because Pope Paul VI says in it, getting rid of Latin is not a good thing. It's not a good thing. Getting rid of Gregorian chant is not a good thing. Doing without many of the beautiful prayers of the Mass is not a good thing. He says the only reason that we can justify these changes is because it's going to, and then he lists what's going to happen. It's going to bring in the Protestants. It's going to fill the seminaries and the convents. It's going to give the people an increased and deeper knowledge of the Blessed Sacrament and what it's all about. Well, I mean, I think in 2012 we can ask ourselves, did the new Mass bring these results, or did it bring other results? It's a very simple question with a very simple answer, I would suggest. But God is not mocked. And the Church, which becomes weak and sickly based on such experimentation, has to be rebuilt, has to be strengthened, has to be remade. And it is the job of every single Roman Catholic who has been given the grace of coming to the traditional Mass and knowing how important it is to live the consequences of that grace. We cannot simply sit back and let it roll over us and say, ah, this is so great. That's not good enough for now. It's very easy to rip things down, but it takes a long time to rebuild. You and I will probably not see the ultimate results. That doesn't matter. We each have a grace which is given to us. We have to make the most of that grace. We have to build up on it. We have to build it up. And so we see even our Holy Father now gives communion only on the tongue, unless it's somebody like the Queen of Spain who thinks she is God apparently and can just grab the host from him, but never mind, she's the anomaly that proves the rule. The Holy Father goes in the midst of these Australian bishops and these French bishops who were wild. They sent emissaries to say, the Pope can't do that. It's not what our people are used to. Until Monsignor Gasvin finally, the Pope's assistant, finally had to say, look, this is the story. The Pope is coming to your country. He's going to give out Holy Communion, and in giving Holy Communion, he's going to obey the law, the universal law of the Church. And what you do is up to you. That's a little picture of what we're up against. We shouldn't underestimate it. One bishop who will remain nameless said to Father Bissig when he came to do a ceremony at the seminary for us, and Father Bissig was going on, University Ecclesia is beautiful, you know, we have the training for the priest and so on and so forth. And the bishop was listening to him. And he said, don't kid yourself, Father. There is tremendous opposition to what you stand for and what you represent. And you need to understand that and be aware of it, because you've got to work on it, and unfortunately, in some instances, you've got to work against it. Now, that's all I'm going to say now. In the second talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about something in Scripture which I hope will be helpful for you in understanding that our Mass was not an invention. It was not a political move. It was not the result of a committee. It's something which goes back much more deeply and much more essentially. And I thank you for your patience.